Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Human Nutrition. We are going to start in on the water-soluble vitamins next. So we finished up the fat-soluble A, D, E, and K. Now we'll dive in. There's actually more water-soluble vitamins, so they will start to get a little bit confusing. I would definitely encourage everyone to make sure you're keeping track of all of these. It's a great time to take notes. You should be able to recognize which of these vitamins are fat soluble and which of them are water soluble. You will need to know some important food sources for each of the water soluble vitamins that we're going to go over in this lecture. So probably the top three foods that is in each one. We're going to go over how each water soluble vitamin is absorbed, transported, stored, and excreted. Fortunately, most of these are pretty similar. If there's some exceptions, we'll be sure to point that out during the lecture. You'll definitely have to know the major functions of each of these, and we'll also need to know the deficiency symptoms for each water-soluble vitamin. Some of them actually have a disease specifically associated with the deficiency. You'll certainly have to know the name of that, who is most likely to have that, so what sort of things lead to that deficiency disease. Um, and what it looks like, what happens to the human body when you have that deficiency. And of course, some of these vitamins will also have toxicities associated with them, not all of them, but some of them, which happens when you have excess consumption of certain water-soluble vitamins. So just a quick overview of water-soluble vitamins in general. You already knew this, but as a reminder, we don't store water-soluble vitamins as much, so storage in the body tissues is minimal, and because of that, the risk of toxicity is generally less than in fat-soluble vitamins. Kind of another general fact about water-soluble is many of the B vitamins, which are water-soluble, act as coenzymes. And if you remember back to maybe sports nutrition, or if you had the energy metabolism lecture, um, coenzymes for energy metabolism are really important for the body to make ATP, which is the energy source for the human body. So if you look, kind of think about what a coenzyme is, this would be an inactive enzyme, so one that isn't able to perform its function at all, or at least not very effectively. This would be a vitamin coenzyme, so one of the B vitamins, because of their amino acids in them, because these are, enzymes are specialized types of protein, they have a unique shape. That vitamin coenzyme can bind to the enzyme, and now we have an active enzyme that is able to perform its function. And again, a lot of the enzymes that drive the citric acid cycle, which takes ATP, makes ATP, requires B vitamins as the coenzymes. One of the things that makes these water-soluble vitamins, especially the B vitamins, confusing is because they are referred to by sometimes their B vitamin name, which you've probably heard of or maybe seen on a food label, but its function in the body as a coenzyme has its own coenzyme name. So very similar and can be confusing. A lot of times when you are looking at graphs or something like that, even in your chapter, they're not going to write out the whole coenzyme name, especially when they're describing a chemical reaction in which this is a coenzyme for. They're going to use the abbreviation, which is shown here. So here's a nice list of our B vitamins: thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, pantothenic acid, biotin, vitamin B6, folic acid, and vitamin B12. And here's the corresponding name of the coenzyme, so an important function in the human body of that particular B vitamin. Another thing that's going to be confusing is besides B6 and B12, none of them sound like B vitamins, but they are. Just a little true false to get our minds warmed up and thinking about preserving vitamins in foods. So fruits and vegetables are a rich source of many of the vitamins and later on minerals that we will be talking about. So when you eat these healthy foods, you want to get as much of the vitamins and minerals as possible. So true or false, most fruits and vegetables will last longer if you refrigerate them. The answer to that is generally true. Cooler temperatures tend to slow down the breakdown process and preserve the fruits and vegetables longer. Most of you will have a special drawer in your refrigerator that's designated for fruits and vegetables. Sometimes you can kind of control the humidity, and that will allow the fruits and vegetables to last as long as possible. Second one, true or false? You should trim, cut, and peel fruits and vegetables shortly after buying them to keep them from spoiling. That is actually false. As soon as you start trimming, cutting, and peeling, you're exposing more of the fruit or vegetable to the air, which is going to kickstart some of these oxidation reactions that are going to actually make it spoil sooner. So it's better to just kind of put it in the refrigerator and leave it, and then um, do all of the trimming and cutting and all that good stuff right before you're going to consume. Next one, the best way to cook vegetables is to boil them. That is actually false. I can give you a nice visual if you want to understand why that happens. If you would boil broccoli, for example, you'll notice that the color of the water that you've boiled it in has started to turn green. That is because a lot of times the color that the fruit or vegetable has is because of some of the vitamins, sometimes phytochemicals that are in it. And because they're water soluble, the water is sort of leaching the vitamin and the phytochemicals out of it. So you can visibly see that in the water, and unless you're going to drink the water, you are going to lose, you have already have lost some of the nutrition. So using as little water as possible to prepare is best. Most people would recommend eating raw, of course, and if you like them cooked, just to steam them to preserve the nutrition. The last one's a bit tricky. Organic fruits and vegetables have more nutrition than non-organic. Um, yeah, there's really some technicalities in that. I would say generally that's false. Organic has to do with the way that the food is grown and the types of fertilizers that are allowed, um, the types of seeds that can be used, things like that. The actual nutritional value isn't hugely different between organic and non-organic. I will say you could make an argument for that being a true statement because organic fruits and vegetables, if you've ever noticed, are often smaller because they don't use some of the same, pesticides and things like that to have them grow. So if they're smaller in size, the nutrition is going to be more concentrated. Um, but I think in general, the answer to that would be actually false from a pure nutrition content standpoint. All right, so we're going to start actually in order. Thiamin is actually our first B vitamin. It could be called vitamin B1, but nobody calls it that. It has its own name again, which is thiamin. Important food sources, again, you have to know these. Pork is a really good source of thiamin, which is kind of weird. Not a lot of our meats have vitamins, but pork is a good source. Sunflower seeds and legumes. Those are all natural sources of thiamine. One of the things that you'll notice as we go through this is legumes, which is kind of these beans, lentils, things like that, are very nutrient rich. They actually contain a ton of vitamins and minerals. So definitely one of a good category of food to consume. There's your pork. Breads and cereals, we're going to have a lot of B vitamins in. I just want to point out that this is enriched. So in the United States, to avoid certain deficiencies, when we process our grains, a lot of the nutrition gets removed. An enriched grain is one where the nutrition has been added back, and thiamine is one of those B vitamins that is added back. snack. So when you eat bread and cereal and pasta, um, at least in the United States, it will have a pretty good source of thiamine in it. In terms of needs and upper level, please don't memorize these numbers. You will not be tested on them. This is just kind of for general information. You should know, though, that thiamine is not a common deficiency. We tend to get enough of it. Just about all the B vitamins that are in enriched grains, because it's such a common food that people eat, are not going to be common deficiencies. That enrichment process has really prevented major deficiencies in those nutrients, which is exactly why we started doing it in the first place. Thiamine does not have a UL. Remember, that's a upper limit for toxicity. So that basically tells you that thiamine is not considered a toxic vitamin. You can't like OD on thiamine. We absorb it in the small intestine. It's going to be true for many of our nutrients. It is transported in our red blood cells as its coenzyme form, and that's the abbreviation from a previous slide. In terms of storage and excretion, we don't store thiamine very well. Mostly it gets excreted, so it ends up in the toilet. Another reason why it's not very toxic, right? You can just pee it out if you have too much. So here's if a more visual way of looking at the food sources. Again, a reminder that pork is a good source. That looks like a pork chop to me. You can see this is, the amount needed to reach the RDA for men and women. Sunflower seeds will get you real quick. Just with one serving, you will have met your RDA. It's also in some of these pork products right here. Here it is in some of our fortified grains. And again, most people kind of on an average American diet are going to have 4 or 5 servings of greens a day. So it's pretty easy to get our thiamine. Total cereal, I don't even know if people still eat that very much, but it's a highly fortified cereal. It's kind of like having a multivitamin in your cereal. And you can see they've fortified about 2 times the RDA in that particular cereal. Thiamine has really one very important function that you should definitely know. Again, when we think about functions in the human body, it's going to be for most of these vitamins as its coenzyme form, thiamine pyrophosphate or TPP. And what thiamine is really good at is decarboxylation reactions, which are important for energy metabolism and amino acid metabolism. So here's a good example of energy metabolism. We're getting glucose, which is of course in our blood usually after breakdown of carbohydrates in the diet. That glucose gets converted to pyruvate, which eventually gets converted to acetyl-CoA, that important um, um, compound that leads into the citric acid cycle for our macronutrients. Um, Thiamine, that in its coenzyme form, is involved in the reaction that takes pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. So that's where its role in energy metabolism is. In terms of other functions, it's also a coenzyme for the transketolase enzyme, and that's going to convert glucose, that sugar, to pentose, which is another type of sugar that's going to have 5. That's where the pent comes into, 5 carbons. And actually, they use this coenzyme function to measure thiamine status. So you can measure thiamine directly in the blood, but you can also measure the activity of this enzyme because the enzyme does not work well if there's not enough thiamine. If it's not at max efficiency, you know that you don't have good thiamine status. So in terms of deficiencies, thiamine deficiency, while not common, is actually extremely dangerous. The disease that happens because of thiamine deficiency is something called beriberi. I don't know what that word comes from. It's kind of unusual, but just remember thiamine deficiency is beriberi. It can show up in two different forms. It can cause peripheral neuropathy. That's why I'm showing this lovely picture of this feet right here. People call that dry neuropathy or dry beriberi. And that is because neuropathy is when you get tingling. It all will almost feel like the bottoms of your feet are on fire. You could also get tingling in your hands. So it's usually the nerve endings in your extremities that are most effective. That's what they mean by peripheral, hands and feet. And again, if you remember neuro, that's going to be your neurological system, in this case, the nerves, and pathy is disease. So a common symptom is feeling like your bottoms of your feet are on fire. Congestive heart failure is wet beriberi. That is when obviously your heart is not working very well, and usually fluid will start to build up. That's what the term wet comes from. So who gets thiamine deficiency? I said it wasn't very common because it's pretty prevalent in our food supply because of enrichment. But because thiamine gets excreted and not stored, if you go 14 days with no thiamine, you can quickly develop a deficiency. And you can kind of probably think of a lot of disease states where you really maybe aren't eating much of anything. Maybe just because you're really, really sick. Maybe you're starving yourself on purpose or have some type of eating disorder. Um, Whatever it may be, 14 days is not too much. So again, this deficiency can develop really, really quickly. We tend to see it in other countries where white rice, which is not enriched in all places, is a staple food. So if most of your calories are coming from white rice, that's a poor source of thiamine, and you could develop beriberi. People who are really sick, especially if their digestive system is impacted and they're on something called parental nutrition, where they're getting nutrition through their veins, they have to make sure that they're getting thiamine put in there as well so they don't develop this. People who are losing a lot of fluids because of severe nausea and vomiting and diarrhea can develop beriberi. People who've had weight loss surgery, if you know anything like about gastric bypass, we talked a little bit about that for chapter 10. That does affect absorption of thiamine, and so people who've had that surgery are supposed to be taking in multivitamins to supplement some of these. And the last one is something called Wernicke-Korsakoff. This is a disease caused by excessive alcohol use. Thiamine is one of those vitamins that's involved in metabolism of alcohol because it can get depleted. Another reason why it would be even worse is if someone was consuming alcohol and not eating food. Alcohol does not have thiamine in it. And also if the alcohol consumption is causing vomiting and diarrhea, you'd be losing it even more. So alcoholics are one group that are more prone to thiamine deficiency. So moving along, we're now up to vitamin B2, which is most commonly known as riboflavin. In terms of where we get riboflavin in our diet, milk has riboflavin in it. Just like thiamine, we add riboflavin to our enriched grains. It's also found naturally in eggs and most of our meats. In terms of needs and upper level, it's very similar to thiamine. It is an uncommon deficiency because it is in foods that we tend to consume. We also don't need a ton of it. It's needed in pretty small amounts. It is not toxic, so there's no upper limit. In terms of absorption, it's also absorbed in the small intestine, but it does need a little hydrochloric acid from the stomach to be properly absorbed. It gets transported throughout the body by special protein carriers. You can store it, but you excrete it very easily in your urine as well. Here's our food sources. Looks like at least cows, store a little bit of it in their liver. So if you eat it, you get a good riboflavin source. But again, it's in a pretty wide variety of foods, especially different types of meats and fishes and beans and all of our dairy products. And of course, in all of our fortified grains. So even if you eat just a little bit of a varied diet, you'll probably get your riboflavin. In terms of our functions, this is also going to be a important coenzyme for energy metabolism. If you've ever kind of looked at the nitty gritty of the citric acid cycle, let's see if I can move this out of the way. I don't want to mess it up. Um, Again, involved in ATP. Every time you see FAD and FADHT and FMN, those are abbreviations for the coenzyme form, and you know we are talking about the coenzyme form of riboflavin. So we're actually extremely important for energy metabolism. If you remember what beta oxidation is, if you ever learned that, that is how we make what we do with fats that you've consumed that can be used to make energy, and the electron transport system also used to make a large chunk of our ATP. So riboflavin is involved in all of those reactions. Um, Riboflavin also helps out other B vitamins like niacin, B6, and folate. It's involved in the metabolism of those vitamins. So, picture's worth 1,000 words, right? What happens when you have riboflavin deficiency? You officially have a riboflavinosis. That's after 2 months of not having a good riboflavin source. And that is most commonly diagnosed because of its effect on the tongue and the corners of your mouth. So with a riboflavinosis, your tongue um, will have very deep cracks in it. You can see in the picture, it looks like it's bleeding almost. In the corners of the mouth, I've seen this in people had just sort of dry skin, but if again you kind of have those cracks that look like they would bleed very easily or are bleeding a little bit, that can be a sign of riboflavin deficiency. We most often see it in alcoholics. It's going to be very similar as the reasons we said for thiamine. Elderly who might not have the best diet due to a variety of conditions. Adolescent girls, especially if they're having a somewhat restrictive diet or not eating a variety of foods. And during adolescence, we usually have high nutrient needs because of growth and things like that. Another fun fact about riboflavin, it is light sensitive, meaning that if it's out in the light, it will start to be destroyed. That's why our milk containers um, have special plastic or come in cardboard to protect the riboflavin from degrading. Um, Another case where we might have problems with riboflavin, some types of medications can increase riboflavin breakdown. These are generally medications that are used for sleeping aids and seizures. So one of the side effects of those drugs would increase someone's likelihood for riboflavin deficiency. It might need either supplementation or extra riboflavin in the diet. So that's B2. B3 is niacin. Niacin is something you can have as its vitamin form, niacin. You can also make niacin from an amino acid, tryptophan. A lot of people recognize tryptophan as amino acid. That's the one that's in turkey that makes us feel kind of sleepy around Thanksgiving. Preformed niacin, which is niacin as niacin. The natural form of the vitamin is found in poultry, meat, fish, enriched grains, and some coffee and tea. Um, because it's in sort of commonly eaten foods, we'll learn that we don't often see it as a deficiency. And now we're up to our third B vitamin that's in enriched grains. So again, we're going to have thiamine, riboflavin, and niacin every time we eat bread and cereal and pasta, at least in the United States and other countries that do it. Because we have different forms of niacin, we actually express the recommended dietary allowance as niacin equivalents. Um, we get, again, we can make it from protein and specifically the amino acid tryptophan. So for every 60 milligrams of tryptophan in a food, that's equivalent to 1 milligram of niacin. For every gram of protein, that's equivalent to 10 milligrams of tryptophan, and then you'd have to keep doing the conversions. This can be similar to what we did with vitamin A and vitamin E, where you have these different forms that have varying levels of activity. So we make an equivalent so to get everybody kind of on the same unit. Here's our food sources. A lot of different foods, right? Almonds, peanut butter, so different types of nuts and fish, and chicken's a really good source. Potatoes a little bit, and then all of our enriched grain products, our fortified cereals. Fairly prevalent in our diet. Um, Usually in the United States, we get plenty of niacin, so our intake exceeds the RDA. There is a UL, or upper limit of safety, of 35 milligrams. This is only for supplements and fortified foods. So the form of the vitamin that they use for supplements and fortified foods can build up and become toxic. The form of the vitamin in protein and found naturally in the foods is not considered to be toxic. It absorbs very easily just through passive diffusion. It gets transported to the liver. It can be stored, but it can also be excreted in our urine. So in terms of functions and deficiencies, here we have another coenzyme. When you look at the citric acid cycle for energy metabolism, and every time you see NAD and NADPH, you're talking about niacin. You need niacin. Excuse me, allergy season. You need niacin for catabolism of carbohydrate, fat, and protein. So getting those important macronutrients broken down to be made for energy requires niacin. In fact, it's required in at least 200 chemical reactions in the body. So it's a really very, very important coenzyme. If you do develop a deficiency, you would have something called pellagra. That's the name of the deficiency disease. You can see that it's pretty clear when someone has pellagra. It really starts to affect their skin. It looks very scaly, almost like they have like snake skin or something like that. And then you get this strange sort of ring around your neck. Almost looks like they have a weird tan line or it got really dirty here, but that is in fact a sign and symptom of pellagra. This is most common in countries where the predominant food, the staple food, is corn. Think about cultures that might use like corn tortillas as their main grain. Corn is not a good source of thiamine. So there you go, that's why I have the no sign through the corn tortillas. Because it's not a good source of niacin, if you're getting most of your calories from corn, you can develop pellagra. We also use niacin in pharmacological doses. Nicotinic acid, which can be prescribed by a doctor, is actually just a high dose of niacin. And the reason why that is prescribed at 60 times the RDA, which is why it has to be under the doctor's supervision, is because it can help lower your LDL or your bad cholesterol and increase your HDL or your good cholesterol. Niacin's good for you. Having this amount through diet would be difficult, so this is prescribed as a supplement. Here's just a reminder, every time you see these oxidation reduction reactions, this is niacin acting as its coenzyme form. and it is literally all over um, these catabolic reactions and the citric acid cycle itself. So very and very important coenzyme. Pantothenic acid's a bit of a weird one. We're up to vitamin B5 now. It's in a ton of foods, so it's in meat, it's in milk products, and many, many vegetables. We don't have a true RDA, so we don't have a functional marker, so we use that adequate intake. It's extremely uncommon in the US to have a deficiency. I've never encountered anyone with a deficiency. It's also not toxic, which is probably why we don't talk about it very much. It's just not one that we really have to worry about too much. It does have an important function as coenzyme IA needed to form acetyl-CoA. So again, it's involved in energy metabolism. Just one function, so pretty easy to remember. Biotin, another B vitamin. We find it in whole grains, eggs. Eggs are a great source of biotin, nuts and legumes, all those kind of beanie type things. Um, Similar to pantothenic acid, it's an AI instead of an RDA. It's not a common deficiency. It's not toxic. We absorb it in our small intestine. We can store it in our muscle, liver, and brain, and we can excrete it in urine and bile. So it's fairly easy for the body to sort of manage it, so to speak. It is functioned as a coenzyme, of course. And any chemical reaction where you have to add carbon dioxide, biotin is probably involved. It's also required in energy metabolism for carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. You can have a deficiency um, if you don't have an active form of biotinase, the enzyme that helps metabolize biotin. You start to see problems with rashes, hair loss, convulsions, and impaired growth. And we see this in very odd circumstances. People who eat a lot of raw eggs, right? Over 12 a day, which would be very unusual. Raw eggs have a binding agent, avidin, that binds up the biotin and makes it not able to perform its function. I don't think most people are running around eating more than 12 raw eggs a day. I don't know, maybe like a bodybuilder or something like that. I don't know if people still do that. But it's a bad idea because of biotin. It's also a bad idea because of food safety issues. So don't eat raw eggs, especially a lot of them. All right, we're getting about to the halfway point. I'm actually going to quickly go through vitamin B6 and then we're going to take a break and divide this lecture up into two parts. So you're almost done with part one. We're now up to 6, vitamin B6. One of the easy ones to recognize is a B vitamin because that's what most people call it. In terms of foods, it's in meat, fish, poultry, fortified cereals, and good old potatoes. See all the meats, all the fortified cereals. Um, Deficiency is fairly uncommon in the US. It's in quite a few foods. This is one, it's highlighted in red because it's unusual to have a B vitamin have a UL. We haven't had a lot so far, right? So over 100 milligrams a day can actually cause permanent nerve damage. So you really want to be careful about over supplementing with vitamin B6. In terms of absorption, very easily absorbed via passive diffusion. B6 gets transported to the liver, it gets phosphorylated, so a phosphate group gets added to it. We can store it in our liver or we can excrete it. But because again, it does get stored, that's one clue that we might have to start worrying about buildup and toxicity. In terms of food sources, this is just kind of another plug for whole grains. We talked a little bit about this when we did carbohydrates. So remember a whole grain, this would be wheat, and they're kind of blowing it up. So this is like a single grain right here from the wheat. A whole grain means that you keep all of this. A processed grain like you'd find in white bread, they've removed everything except for the endosperm, this part. So when you have the whole grain, this graph down here is just showing you the increase in nutrient content when you have the whole grain versus the processed one. So you can see we've highlighted here for white rice and for bread, vitamin B6 is much, much higher, 100 to 200% higher when you don't process the grain. So again, another plug for whole grains. And if you're curious, you also are going to get more potassium, zinc, magnesium, and fiber from the whole grain food versus the processed grain. So here's the RDA for an adult, showing you a potato, which is a reasonable source. Here's the different meats and nuts. We find it in some fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and sometimes it's fortified to foods as well. In terms of function, its coenzyme form is abbreviated as PLP. It's involved in more than 100 different enzymatic reactions. Anytime you have a reaction that involves nitrogen, and again, nitrogen is most commonly from amino acid because all amino acids contain nitrogen. So anytime the body's got a chemical reaction involving amino acids, nitrogen, probably vitamin B6's coenzyme is involved. Um, in terms of what some of these chemical reactions are doing, they do help synthesize very important compounds in the human body. So heme is a protein in our blood, part of hemoglobin. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers throughout the body, especially for our nervous system. And it also helps make niacin. Remember, we could make niacin from tryptophan, which is in fact an amino acid that has nitrogen. Where do we see deficiencies? People who have a very poor diet, so they're basically eating not very much of anything or just mostly processed food, like thiamin and sometimes riboflavin. We see it with alcoholism. Medications, especially the most famous would be medications to treat Parkinson's disease, deplete vitamin B6. So you have to be careful for anyone on those types of drugs. And the deficiency, we don't have a name for it, so it would just be vitamin B6 deficiency. But if you have it, you can get anemia, convulsions, and confusion. Here's an example of a chemical reaction that would involve the vitamin B6 coenzyme form. So this would be a transamination reaction. We did this when we did proteins, where we're transferring a nitrogen group to something else to form a new amino acid, um, specifically a non-essential amino acid, right? Because it could be formed in the human body. In terms of pharmacological use, so like niacin, you can have a doctor prescribe high doses of vitamin B6. This has, because of its role in the nervous system, been used to try and treat carpal tunnel syndrome. The literature says maybe it helps with some of that pain associated with that. They've investigated B6 to help the symptoms of PMS. Um, Women are mostly familiar with sometimes the cramping and the moods that happen right before a woman's period. It does not seem to be very helpful for that. Also, a lot of women experience nausea. You've probably heard the term morning sickness before pregnancy. Possibly vitamin B6 may help with that. All right, let's take a little break here, and then we'll return to the rest of the B or the water soluble vitamins in a bit.